All right. Well, welcome everybody to the Housing Trust Fund Operating Subsidy Due Diligence Training. This session will be recorded and we'll post it on our website in a few days along with PowerPoint for those who can't attend or want to look back. So my name is Vicki Farden and I'm the Supportive Housing Policy Specialist and Operating Subsidy Program Manager at Minnesota Housing. And I'm joined by Meredith Mayrand, who will cover most of the due diligence items that you will need to complete your grant agreement. So thanks for participating today, and we'll have time for questions. So if you have a question during the presentation, you can either type in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you can click on questions and you can type in your question and click the send button, and we'll hold those till the Q&A section. And you can also type in your questions anytime during the session. And then there's also a hand raising feature. You can just click on that and raise your hand when we're in the Q&A section at the end. So there's two ways to do that. Next slide. So our mission is housing is a foundation for success, so we collaborate with individuals, communities, and partners to create, preserve, and finance housing that is affordable. Next slide. So, well, congratulations everyone for a successful completion of your application and your award of funding. I wish we had more funds to award, but we just haven't had any new money for a really long time. So today we'll go over just some basic program information, and then the due diligence materials, the submission timelines, and then have time for questions at the end. Next slide. So one thing we wanted to make sure to review with you is we have a new draw request form for this grant term that you have to use when you submit your payment requests. The form includes some new reporting information, as well as some different information about exactly what the funds will be spent on. So next slide. So you'll need to identify specific budget line items that will be paid with the grant funds. And so, you know, especially for revenue shortfall, I know we're just covering the gap of what your revenues don't pay for, but with our new grants management policies, you need to clearly identify a line item or line items that the grant will pay for, so that if needed, you can easily submit documentation to show that cost and that payment. So that's something to think about, and we'll look at the form in a second to talk about that more. And then we also are asking you to report data to track equity outcomes. So we're asking you for some occupancy and demographics data, some housing denial data, and eviction and non-renewal of lease data. So Meredith, do you want to open the draw request form? All right. So this is, you know, familiar. The instructions are at the top, and then you enter your project information and the fiscal year you're requesting funds for. and then the amount you're requesting for each type of use for service coordination, front desk, revenue shortfall, and the total. So then the next section is where you need to show your specific line items from your operating budget. So this should be relatively easy for tenant service coordination and front desk to show staff costs, hours, etc. for those costs for the use of the operating subsidy. And for revenue shortfall, I think that'll be the more difficult one, but try and pick as like the most easily documented items that you pay for out of your operating budget, and the least amount. So something that would be easy to show, like paying your utility, any of your utilities or things like that, contracted services, things like that. So if you have questions about that, you can contact Meredith or myself when you're doing your draw request. So scroll down, Meredith. And then for some of the occupancy information, just asking you about the occupancy during the year, how many units there are, how many were occupied on the first day of the fiscal year, move-outs, move-ins, and how many units are occupied at the last day, and then the vacancy rate for the year. And then we're asking for your demographics, how many total households you served during the year, how many heads of household had a disabling condition, and then race and ethnicity for your head of household, for each head of household. And so you just enter the number that are in each of those categories. Okay, then the next section is the tenant screening data. Hopefully you've collected this information, but if you haven't, you'll need to start now. The number of applicants that have been denied in the last year based on your tenant screening criteria. And then the next section is the reason for the denial. And then for each of those, for rental history, for example, then you need to tell us the number by race of the head of household. So if there was one person that was white, you would put 1 white, 1 black, 1 Asian, etc. And then the same for ethnicity. And then the number, if any, had a disabling condition. And so the same for each category if people were denied. Then the next section is on lease information. So the number of evictions or non-renewals of lease, you would enter the number of households that were evicted or where the lease was not renewed. And then the next section is the demographics for those households for the 2 categories. So this is new. So if you have questions about that when you're submitting your draw, you can always ask, just ask me. And then as usual, you sign it and submit it through our grants management email that Meredith will talk about. And then then you could go back to the PowerPoint. And then the last thing is the tenant selection plan guidelines. Hopefully you're all familiar with the guidelines that we revised in December of 2020. Because you received new funding, you're required to follow those guidelines. So make sure you look at that screening criteria. We have new screening criteria that require you to review supplemental evidence from an applicant prior to acceptance or denial of their application. And then there's specific screening criteria for their housing history, income and credit history, and criminal background. So make sure you review that, and you should update your tenant selection plan. But we're not going to ask you to submit a revised one right now, but we may ask to look at it when we're monitoring. So that's something that you should work on. I think most of you as supportive housing providers have pretty inclusive screening criteria, so hopefully this would not require a lot of updates. But we do have a tenant, there's a link on this slide to go to our tenant selection plan page, and that we also have like a help text checklist to help you go through your tenant selection plan to update it. So that's it for some of the, the major changes we wanted to make sure we went over with you all, and then we'll take questions after Meredith goes through the due diligence pieces. So thanks. Go ahead, Meredith.
Thanks, Vicki. Good morning, everyone. My name is Meredith Mayrand, and I'll be working with you through this due diligence phase and working to get your contracts executed. So we're going to go through the grant contract agreement today, the board resolution, proof of insurance, authorized representative information, SWIFT vendor number and W-9, and electronic funds transfer authorization forms. Some grantees may have additional items required through the due diligence phase, so please refer to your selection letter for any additional requirements that you might need to submit in addition to these items. So we ask that you review the entire grant contract agreement and all of the exhibits that were sent to you to ensure accuracy and understand compliance. The contract that was sent to you was for informational purposes. We will be routing that contract for signature via DocuSign once all of your other due diligence items have been received and approved. So no need to route that internally to your signers, but please do review it and reach out with any questions that you might have. Because we'll be routing via DocuSign, we ask that you also identify the name, email addresses, and routing order if applicable for all of your authorized signers. So I just want to call out a couple of important dates in your grant contract agreement. The effective date will be the start of the fiscal year for your development or the date when the contract is fully executed, whichever comes later. So it will be either July 1st, 2022, October 1st, 2022, January 1st, 2023, or possibly later if there's some type of delay with the execution. This is the date when all parties have signed the grant contract agreement, both your signers and ours, and it's the date when you can start incurring costs under the terms of the grant contract. So any expenses incurred prior to the execution of the contract by both parties are not allowed. This is a 2-year grant, so the grant period will be the start date of the grant contract through either June 30th, 2024, September 30th, 2024, or December 31st, 2024, depending on the fiscal year of your development. This is the time period in which the grant proceeds must be incurred and expended, so no funds can be used prior to or after this period. And the expiration date will be 3 months after the end of the grant period. And this allows some additional time for all final reports and documents to be submitted and any other requirements be met by Minnesota Housing and you as the grantee agency. So you can refer to your grant contract agreement for those 3 dates and how they apply to your development. Okay, so next is the board resolution. The board resolution should come from the grantee organization's board of directors. We do understand that some grantees may not have a board of directors, so this item should come from an entity on your organizational chart, such as your general partner, sole member, etc. And if the resolution is coming from an affiliated entity, it should include the actual grantee or ownership entity in the language of the resolution, and should be clear that the grant contract agreement is with the grantee or the ownership entity. Since some organizational charts are more complex than others, if you have questions about the language to include in your board resolution that will include what Minnesota Housing requires for contracting and signing purposes, please do feel free to reach out to us in advance. This could reduce the need for multiple submissions to be approved. So if there is any doubt about what language to include, please feel free to reach out in advance. The resolution should also list the particular grant program, so the Housing Trust Fund Operating Subsidy. It should identify the full grant amount along with the names of the individuals who are authorized to sign the grant contract agreement. Okay, we're asked that you submit a certificate of liability documenting proof of insurance. It must be employee dishonesty or crime coverage and at least 1/8 the amount of the total grant award. I do want to just highlight that we cannot accept employee theft coverage, so please be sure to just review what's included on that certificate before submitting. Again, if you have questions in advance, feel free to reach out. The certificate must list Minnesota Housing as the certificate holder, and the policy must be current with the expiration after the start of the grant term. Both the grantee and the development must be noted on the certificate as covered entities. I will just make a note that while this should be for the grantee agency, if it is submitted for the property management company, it should list and specify both the development and the grantee and ownership entity. On your authorized representative, this is the person who will be the main contact for this grant, and there's a portion of your grant contract agreement where this information will be added in. So when you submit your due diligence items, we ask that you include in the body of the email the following information for who that person will be: the name, title, address, phone number, and email address. If this person changes at any time during the grant term, you'd want to notify us as soon as possible so we can update our information and reach out accordingly. We want to make sure we have all the correct information set up for payment purposes, so we ask that you submit your SWIFT vendor number. If you've not registered as a vendor with the state of Minnesota, you'll need to complete that prior to receiving payment. And as Vicki mentioned, we'll be posting these slides to our website, so this link will be available should you have questions or need to set up the SWIFT vendor number. In addition to the vendor number, we ask that you send in a copy of your W-9. If you have questions about either of these items, feel free to reach out. And then we also do ask that you submit an electronic funds transfer form if you've had a change to the banking information where funds should be deposited. So we have the initial authorization form or the bank change form linked here. Submit those as needed. Some of you may not need to submit this item. We ask that you submit all the items to mhfa.grants@state.mn.us and include in the subject line HTFOS for the Operating Subsidy Program and then your grantee name. Please name all the documents by your grantee name and then the name of the due diligence item, and submit as soon as possible to allow enough time for documents to be reviewed, revised if needed, and then approved. You can submit all of your items at once, or if you have certain items ready to be sent in and others will be ready later, you can send them separately, whatever works best for you. All items must be received and approved prior to the execution of the grant contract agreement. Reimbursement of expenses incurred prior to the full execution of the contract will not be allowed. And we are asking that all items be submitted and received by 4:30 p.m. on Friday, June 3rd. For those of you whose effective date of your grant contract agreement is October 1st or January 1st, and this deadline poses any type of problem, please reach out to us in advance to request an extension or to discuss submission of those items. Please feel free to reach out anytime during this process to the mhfa.grants email. And as Vicki had mentioned, you can reach out to her if you have questions as well. But anything related to due diligence can be directed to the grants email, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Okay, and with that, we can open it up for questions. Feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the question box so that we can get that answered for you.
Yep, so we have a couple questions in the question box. Nancy Cashman asked, can you please define eviction? So basically a notice to vacate or an unlawful detainer. And then for non-compliant, for a mutual termination, you would select the other category. So use your best judgment on that. Does that answer your question, Nancy? I don't know if you can talk, but Meredith, what do they need to do if they want to talk? Do they raise their hand and we unmute them?
Yep.
Yep.
Nancy should be able to talk now.
She got me, Vicki. Thanks. So what I'm just trying to clarify is it's not just evictions at the level of the court. So you're looking for if we've given an eviction notice, maybe gone to court, maybe they weren't evicted, like just like which spot of the circle should we be tracking?
Yeah, I think that would still be like an eviction because you're not like just agreeing to end the lease with the tenant, if that makes sense.
Yep. So yep. I think that helps me.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
And then Davis had a question about, do we just send the SWIFT number via email?
Yes, you can just include the SWIFT vendor number in the body of the email when you submit your other items.
And then there's another question. What if we can't get a signed board resolution before June 3rd? The next full board meeting isn't until June 15th.
If you have concerns with the timing of when your board meets, please just reach out to us in advance so that we're aware of the timing and we can make sure that we have everything in place to get your contract executed as soon as possible.
And then another question, is a mutual agreement to terminate considered an eviction? No, that would be the other category. And I forget what it is right now. Is it non-compliance or? Meredith, can you pull that up for a sec?
Yep, just one moment here.
Okay. Oh yeah, non-renewal of lease or mutual termination. So, so that if it's a mutual agreement to terminate the lease, that you would select the second category, non-renewal of lease or mutual termination. So, and I hope that answers your question.
Vicki, it looks like there's a couple more. One is, what is the time frame for the demographics and eviction screening metrics?
Oh, yes, thanks. You know, I just was trying to read the questions in the little box and I finally opened it to see the full questions. So for the fiscal year, for the draw fiscal year, that's the time frame. So when you submit your next draw, it would be for the year completed of your development's fiscal year, if that makes sense. I know that since your first draw is in advance, you might not have all the information for the last year. So just complete with what you can and make a note of that you weren't collecting certain specific pieces of information. I would think you would have some of it, but just make a note for your first draw if you weren't able to collect it for the full year. And then, for next year, you'll have to have it for that full year. So, yeah, so I think Davis had 2 questions about that. Davis, let us know if you still have a question about that. You can raise your hand or just type in another question. The new draw request form is required for the next draw request. The current grant, we've processed all the draw requests for the current grant, so that's done. The next draw request you'll do will be for your new grant. So the draw request form will be required for that next draw. So Nikki, let us know if we didn't answer, if you still have questions about that. Or Shannon had the same question. And then Anna, are we going back through this data 1 year from current? I think I answered that. It's for the year of the draw, the previous budget year for your grant. Great, okay. All right. Well, if nobody else has any more questions, I don't see any hand raise or questions coming in. So you can contact me for any program type questions or questions about the draw request reporting section. And you, of course, contact Meredith through her email or through the grants email for any questions about your due diligence submissions. And that's also where you submit your draw requests. So, so we will just thank you for attending today, and I hope this was helpful. And as we said, we'll be posting this on our website in a few days, and we'll let you know when that happens. So thanks for attending today, and we look forward to another productive couple of years with the Operating Subsidy Program. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.